Welcome everybody. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Seth Stadel, who besides a BA and a Master of Divinity, holds an MSc in Syriac Studies from the University of Oxford, where he also discussed recently his DPhil in Oriental Studies. And he has recently been appointed as a research associate in the School of History, Politics and International Relations at the University of Leicester, where he will be working in the ERC-funded TOSSE project. His publications have focused on the development of the biblical canon, early Christian spirituality. I remember especially on prayer of Evagrius, and the reception of the Psalms in late antique and early medieval theology. His first monographs, which is based on his DPhil, will be soon published with Brill in 2023, and the title, which is also the title of his DPhil, is The Heirs of Theodore, Aḥob of Qatar, and the development of the East Syriac exegetical tradition. In the future, he plans to edit the Denha Grigori commentary, which is a 9th century, probably 9th century East Syriac Psalms commentary that draws on earlier Greek and Syriac sources, as well as on contemporary Arabic glosses. Today, he will talk about biblical interpretation in Pre-Islamic Persia, Aḥob of Qatar, and the sources of his Old Testament exegetical works. Seth, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dan, I'm gonna share screen here. Can everybody see that?
No, it's not yet control.
Okay.
Not yet.
We'll try again. Let's see. Okay.
Excellent.
Okay.
Yeah, great. Now it works.
I didn't click hard enough. I apologize. Okay. To begin, Aḥob of Qatar is an East Syriac biblical commentator. His extant Old Testament exegetical works are exclusively preserved in later East Syriac writers and manuscript traditions, largely in the form of scholia. And just to present some of them, and then another slide further. In total, there are 34 attributed scholia. There may be others, but they are anonymous and haven't been identified as of yet. And then there is one full literary text referred to as the Cause of the Psalms. While a portion of my research on Aḥob focuses on the use and development of his Old Testament exegetical works by the later East Syriac exegetical tradition, for the purposes of this paper, I would like to examine Aḥob's date and the sources of his Old Testament exegetical works. And so just a few others of his scholia here. So concerning Aḥob's date, in a footnote in his edition and Latin translation of Abdisho's catalog of books, Josephus Assamani suggested that Aḥob lived roughly around the year 990. While he does not cite any immediate supporting evidence to validate his claim, Assamani does propose in another footnote on the same page that Abraham of Basra, whose entry directly precedes that of Aḥob's, lived in the year 990. However, Assamani does not appear to have presumed that Abdisho arranged his entries chronologically. For instance, Denha's entry immediately follows Aḥob's, and he footnotes that Denha lived around the year 740. Roger Cowley demonstrated that since Ishadad of Merv, who flourished in the mid-9th century, selectively quotes Aḥob's exegetical works, Aḥob could not have lived over 100 years after Ishadad. Cowley further suggested that this Aḥob should be identified with Ayub, the exegete of Cilicia, who lived at the end of the 6th century. Bastir Haramani agrees with Cowley's assertion of a 6th century time frame for Aḥob on the basis of Jean-Marie Fille's historical study, which shows that by the early 10th century, Christianity had succumbed to Islamic influences in the region of Beth Qaṭraye. However, even if Christianity still existed in Beth Qaṭraye in the late 9th century, it still precedes Assamani's suggested date for Aḥob by roughly 100 years. Aḥob cannot be dated earlier than the mid-6th century because he references the production of Onyata in his Cause of the Psalms, and the earliest composer of Onyata chants was likely John of Beth Qaṭraye, who died around the year 566 or 567. The earliest writer to rely on and quote Aḥob, albeit anonymously, is Nathaniel of Shirzor, who lived around the year 600, whose Cause of the Psalms title states that he was martyred during the time of Khusro II, who reigned from 590 to 628. If Aḥob's Onyata reference and Nathaniel's use of Aḥob are considered along with Duval and Cowley's assertion that the Syriac Aḥob is the same person as the Arabic Ayyub, one can reasonably situate Aḥob in the second half of the 6th century, though perhaps more accurately in the late 6th century. Further evidence for an earlier date for Aḥob consists of the following. The form of Aḥob's two Persian nouns, brocade and dasag, can be dated to pre-Arabic, a pre-Arabic context, specifically Middle Persian. The earliest manuscript tradition to quote Aḥob anonymously is the commentary on Genesis to Exodus 9:32, which Lucas von Rampai has dated to the first half, or even possibly to the beginning of the 8th century. Aḥob's Old Testament scholia are also, should be noted that they are non-encyclopedic in nature, as is not the case, I should say, for later East Syriac commentators such as Theodore Barconi at the end of the 8th century, and then later Ishadad of Merv. So the non-encyclopedic nature of these works by Aḥob suggests an early date. Finally, Thomas Carlson has hinted at an early date for Aḥob on the basis of a quotation attributed to Aḥob and Gabriel Qaṭraye, the latter of whom lived in the first half of the 7th century, which is preserved in Isaac Shabbat-Naya's 15th century prose commentary on his poem on God's governance from In the Beginning Until Eternity. This quotation, which Carlson labels passage 4 in his edition published with Gorgias Press, reflects Shabbat-Naya's knowledge of Gabriel's exegesis, the latter of which likely relied on Aḥob's earlier exegesis on the same New Testament subject, which, as I recall, is from the book of John. Although he does not offer an immediate reason to support his claim, Sebastian Brock disagrees with Cowley's assertion that Aḥob is to be identified as a 6th century figure. In his 1999 Aram article, Brock questioned whether Aḥob was, quote, the same person as the monk at the monastery of Rabbi Kanare in Beth Qaṭraye, who requested Dadisho Qaṭraye in the late 7th century to write his commentary on the Exegetical of Abba Isaiah. This particular Aḥob, who as far as I can tell is the only other Aḥob attested in antiquity, is arguably a different and later Aḥob than the focus of this present paper. The main reasons for this are twofold. One, Nathaniel of Shirzor relies on Aḥob's Cause of the Psalms, as previously mentioned, and two, Aḥob's extant Old Testament scholia tie him to biblical interpretation and not to any aspect of the ascetic tradition. Thus, Aḥob the exegete, who lived in the late 6th century, and Aḥob the monk, who lived in the late 7th century, in my opinion, cannot be the same person. A 6th century setting for Aḥob would place him as a contemporary or slightly earlier contemporary of other influential writers from Beth Qaṭraye, such as Gabriel Qaṭraye, Isaac of Nineveh, and Dadisho Qaṭraye. In order to historically situate Aḥob, the following table, based on studies conducted by Brock and Mario Kozal, lists the known writers from Beth Qaṭraye in rough chronological order. And I would like to state that when Sebastian and Mario have presented this work earlier, they typically present it in a graded manner, where the more influential writers such as Isaac are presented first, and in some ways perhaps rightly so, but then it moves down to the lesser known writers, whereas here I'd like to place it chronologically. However, even with these advances, modern scholarship remains divided over a date for Aḥob. Those who advocate for a 10th century setting, such as Jean-Baptiste Chabot and Jacques-Marie Voustet, seem to largely reproduce Asamani's suggested date. Other scholars, with the exception of Brock and Take Jansma, have suggested a 6th century setting, or at minimum, as one scholar has mentioned, I believe it was Bastir Haramani, suggested just a pre-Islamic context. So in my opinion, unless new evidence surfaces, Aḥob should be dated to the late 6th century. Turning to the sources of Aḥob's Old Testament exegetical works, these can be divided into three categories: Greek, Syriac, and other. And it's also worth noting that Aḥob also makes Christological, polemical, and eschatological statements, each of which draws on a combination of Greek, Syriac, and other sources as well. And in this paper, I would like to discuss briefly one example from each of these categories, beginning with a Greek source. So I'll read the Peshitta text to get a context, and then Aḥob's Scholia. So according to the Peshitta, as a stag calls out for a stream of water, thus also my soul calls out to you, Lord. And Aḥob's Psalm 42, 2 Scholian states, because then stags are by nature more dry and hot than other animals, they especially long for a drink of water when they have eaten of harmful reptiles. Like that which is the gall of snakes, which pollutes and adheres to the roof of their palate, it doubles upon them the heat which is in their nature. It is appropriate that by the example of the stag, these things were used by David to make known his love. So for his Psalm 42, 2 Scholion, Aḥob borrows one fragment from the Physiologus, which is a 2nd or 3rd century Greek text originating from Egypt, that discusses, among other things, the moral strengths and weaknesses of animals. Prior to the 6th century, it was translated into Syriac, and it is preserved in 4 forms: 1, an early form; 2, an expanded form; 3, a longer form; and 4, a fragmented form. Of these 4 forms, only the longer form preserves a text that is similar to Aḥob's Psalm 42, 2 Scholion. If Aḥob's Physiologus fragment is compared with the longer form of the Syriac Physiologus, it appears as follows. There we go. All right, I'll just read the Physiologus side. But when the stag eats the snake, he begins to eat it by its tail and takes all of it into his throat. Then he fits its head in his mouth, and so he bites it off and devours it. And because the head of the snake sticks to the roof of his palate, it vomits a lot of gall into his mouth. And so therefore he thirsts after and calls out for a stream of water. As this table shows, Aḥob reworks the text of the Physiologus, summarizing aspects of it. His Physiologus fragment encompasses nearly all of the Scholion, aside from a few initial and concluding phrases. While he only preserves one identical word, namely gall, mirtha, he uses several similar non-Peshitta words and phrases. One example being the phrase adheres to, sarka ba, while the Physiologus states sticks to, or ba ka'em. While the Physiologus describes the manner by which the stag eats the snake, Aḥob does not mention the parts of the snake being eaten or the order of consumption by the stag. Furthermore, Aḥob suggests concerning the stags, the snake gall adheres to the roof of their palate, whereas the Physiologus states that it is the head of the snake that sticks to the roof of his palate. Aḥob's terse description of the Physiologus at this point suggests that he assumes that his audience either knows the immediate chapter under discussion or the broader text of the Physiologus itself. Turning to a Syriac source, again from the Peshitta, verse 10 of Genesis 15, and Abram took all these animals and he divided them equally, and he placed each member opposite its fellow, but he did not divide the birds. And then verse 10 of Aḥob's Genesis 15, 9 through 10 Scholion states, but that phrase, he divided them equally, that is to say that the parts of each one of them are arranged one opposite the other, and as if that animal is alive. There were 3 rows as the Eucharistic bread is arranged in the paten upon the altar. He places each member opposite its fellow, that is to say, each member which was cut off from its fellow, he placed it opposite the member from which it was cut off. By means of their division, he makes known their vexation and their misery, which they were going to endure in Egypt. But that phrase, they were placed opposite each other, makes known that though they were looking at each other, none was able to help its fellow. But that phrase, he did not divide the birds, indicates their unanimity and unified sojourning in the wilderness, for they were indeed going somehow to fly from Egypt. So in this part of his Scholion, Aḥob makes one reference to the East Syriac liturgy, which is the only time he does so in his known Old Testament exegetical works. After introducing the verse 10 phrase, he divided them equally, here italicized in English. He comments that, quote, there were 3 rows as the Eucharistic bread is arranged in the paten upon the altar. Aḥob's liturgical analogy is a reflection of a common Eucharistic practice in his time, and he likely includes it in his scholia to typologically explain Abram's equal division of the animals. His reference to the Eucharistic bread being laid out in 3 rows offers a rare window into the early East Syriac liturgy, for no other early commentator, as far as I can tell, on the East Syriac liturgy mentions this detail. Nevertheless, it remains unclear whether Aḥob's reference to the Eucharistic bread being laid out in 3 rows implies 3 separate loaves or 1 loaf divided into 3 parts. Since Aḥob is the earliest witness to this Eucharistic practice, it is unfortunately not known when it began. And then turning somewhat finally to a source that I've classified as other, which is taken from his Cause of the Psalms, and I'll just read it. As also now there are many to be found who carry in their mouth debauched songs, and although their words are abominable and unacceptable to the discerning, their repetition, however, does not satiate people, because they are composed of sweet sounds. So in his Cause of the Psalms, in this portion, I should say, Aḥob mentions debauched songs, zemirtho, zelirtho, or secular songs that were popular in his time. While in large part these songs are poorly documented and little is known about them, there is one reference to a particular category of these songs, namely wedding songs in the 6th century. According to the histories of Rabban Hornitz the Persian and Rabban Bar Idtha, the East Syriac monastic leader, Rabban Bar Idtha, who died in 611 or 612, sought to prevent the established custom of purported pagan singing at a local wedding. In its place, he insisted that they should sing the Psalms instead. However, the family of the groom ignored Bar Idtha's plea and instead sang their songs with gladness. It is quite likely that Aḥob is referencing these types of songs, among others, in his phrase, debauched songs. And as a way of concluding, I would like to detail some of the distinctive aspects of both Aḥob and his Old Testament exegetical works, both discussed and not discussed in this paper. As a way of, so to begin, one particular thing is that his influence on the East Syriac exegetical tradition began in the late 6th century, either during his own lifetime or just after his death, and stretched to the late 19th century, a span of roughly 1,300 years. He is the earliest known East Syriac exegete to use other languages to explain difficult Peshitta words and phrases, which establishes a sense of exegetical authority. It also suggests that he was multilingual and interacted with people in the larger Iranian world who also knew these languages. And one other thing is that he does not follow Theodore of Mopsuestius and more broadly Antiochian exegetical approaches without thought. Namely, he does not assume that a pragmatic interpretation is the best and or only manner by which to understand a given Peshitta word or phrase. Concerning Aḥob's Old Testament exegetical works, they contain, among other things, a reference to one part of the East Syriac liturgy, which is not mentioned by any other early commentator on the East Syriac liturgy, medical and philosophical phraseology stemming from Sergius of Reishima's Syriac translations of the Gallant Corpus, and Alexander of Aphrodisias on the principles of the universe, the former of which was likely used within a half-century of Sergius' death. 2 language of Qatar references, which are the earliest known references to this language, 2 Middle Persian references, one of which is unattested elsewhere in Syriac literature, as far as I can tell, 1 reference to painted images and or statues of Greco-Roman emperors of the Shahs and Iranian territories that were being set up and dedicated in the cities of their respective empires, an acknowledgement of the existence of secular songs that were popular in the 6th century, one of the earliest known references to the liturgical innovation of producing unyata, a Christology that is devoid of any notable technical Christological terms, at least in its present form, intentionally brief polemics, and finally an unusual eschatology that does not follow any known system of dating used by Jewish, Greek, or other Syriac writers. And it's worth mentioning there that Isaac Shabbat-Naya in the 15th century is the one who preserves the only bit of his eschatology. And it seems quite likely that Shabbat-Naya has revamped that considerably to suit his own needs at that time. So it's quite likely that probably Aḥob followed some form of dating, but what that was, it's impossible to know now. So in short, Aḥob's extant Old Testament exegetical works are a treasure trove of rare and or unusual references to multiple earlier and contemporary sources. Furthermore, his Old Testament exegetical works and varied sources reveal that he is, quote, one of the heirs of Theodore, namely a distinctive voice within the East Syriac exegetical tradition and not a card-carrying follower of Theodore's exegesis. Aḥob's willingness to propose a non-standard explanation from an East Syriac point of view, namely following Theodore, for a difficult to shit a word or phrase, represents one example of what Adam Becker has called, quote, the dynamic reception of Theodore of Mopsuestia in the 6th century. And it is this independent thinking, among other things, in my belief, that likely helped to secure Aḥob's place as an authoritative figure within the East Syriac exegetical tradition for centuries to come. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Seth, for a fascinating talk. We have time for some questions. So if you have one, just raise a digital hand or even a manual one. I see, okay, Shlomi first, and then afterwards, Sophia.
Thank you very much, Yuni. Thanks very much, Seth. That was illuminating. I must admit, never heard of Aḥob previously, so thank you for that as well. I have two questions, or question and a request. First, you brought us an example of Aḥob's use of Greek sources, his use of the physiologos. Now, the example is very convincing. My question is concerning the Greek, because you compared it, if I understood correctly, to a Syriac long version of the physiologos. So are we to assume that Aḥob was using a Greek version of which we have only a Syriac translation, or is it possible that Aḥob is actually using this Syriac source? So it goes back to a Greek literature, but eventually what he's using is actually Syriac literature. That's one question. The second is, can you give an example of Aḥob's use of Jewish sources? I think that what they're on your other sources as well.
Sure. So to answer your first, his knowledge of Greek would have been very minimal, if at all. He would have very likely been using Syriac translations. He was clearly very well educated. He was multilingual. So what specifically he had access to and chose to use or not use is difficult to say, because only bits and pieces remain of what he originally produced. So yes, he was very likely using the Syriac side of that. If that answers your question, if I've misunderstood, feel free to ask again. As far as a Jewish source, there are several. So a couple. He quotes the Hebrew Old Testament, and one interesting thing there from the analysis that I've done, he's not getting that from earlier Greek sources, such as Theodore or any of the other Antiochian writers. He really does seem to be getting that from a contemporary Jewish person in the city where he lived and worked. He really seems to be interacting with Jews across confessional lines, which is quite rare for his time. So that's one. Another somewhat fascinating thing is that he preserves a reference in his Numbers 21:19 scholion on the walking stone, which is mentioned by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, and then also in several early Christian sources as well. But originally that was a Jewish source. So those are a couple examples of that. But then there are other ways in which he's getting access to Jewish sources in some way, shape, or form, and it seems to be, again, through some kind of person in the city where he's living that actually knows Hebrew texts, rabbinic texts in one form or another, and he's asking them specifically, what does this say about that, and getting that there. So it's quite fascinating in that respect. Yes.
Just a question of clarification, if I may. When you're saying that he's quoting the Hebrew text, he's saying that he's quoting Hebrew, That is not,
Yes, he
not
does.
the Hira.
Yeah, he says, and according to the Hebrew, it states, or something like that. He specifically states that, or when he quotes the Septuagint, he'll say according to the Greek, and he does that several times. Yes.
Just maybe to continue on this, because I seem to think because this reference to Hebrew and Greek versions of words in the Old Testament, this is also issued out of Merv, also does this quite regularly. So are you
Yes.
saying that all of that material comes from Aḥob?
Ishidad actually draws from Turha Ramani has shown this in one of his publications from maybe a decade or so ago, that Ishidad seems to draw some of his Old Testament Hebrew quotes from Aḥob, and not the other way around. And so, which is interesting. And I can't prove it. It's just kind of a hunch that at least one of the ways that he presents his material, he gets that idea from Aḥob as far as using other biblical texts to try and clarify some difficult Peshitta word or phrase. Now, again, Aḥob would not be his only source. Ishidad has a variety of sources that he uses at will. But he very clearly draws on Aḥob, and I developed that at length in my thesis and forthcoming monograph in what is chapter 4. It's actually the largest section of the, but he's definitely a major source for Ishidad.
Okay, Sophia, you had a question.
Thank you very much, sir, for this very interesting presentation. I am very intrigued by the Theodoran material in Aḥob. So how Aḥob used Theodore Mopsestis commentary on Psalms and on Genesis, I guess. Could you elaborate on this a little bit? So this is my first question, and the second question is just about the exegetical methodology. So what kind of methodology Aḥob used, and so it's if it's not exactly Theodoran methodology, so is it non-literal or literal, more like commentary, or just?
Yeah, so for Theodore, in 4 of his scholia, Psalm 5:4, 39:6, 48, and his 45 prologue scholia, those are drawn in one shape or another from Theodore's commentary on the Psalms. And then his commentary in Genesis, it's the what I read from verse 10 of Genesis 15, and then also verse 9 as well. That's taken from Theodore, and the way that for the Psalms, that seems to be a bit more straightforward how he got that. For the other, it seems slightly more complicated as far as the transmission history. What Aḥob was actually using is a bit difficult to know. But there, it's in many ways he's drawing, like for Psalm 5:4, it's basically the entire scholion is directly from Theodore, but he develops it. So there, it's talking about the word, I think it's Saphro, like in the morning I will praise you, Lord. And Theodore says that there are a few different ways to understand that. And then he settles on what would be the most obvious way is the time of day in the early hours of the morning, which I guess anybody who would read that text would probably conclude that seems the most likely meaning of that word. But Aḥob settles on a very not easy to understand definition that he thinks it means something completely different, like basically the speed at which morning comes and the speed by which one would come to prayer before the Lord, which is not, again, very obvious how he comes to that. So that's one way he does that with, say, in Psalm 39, there he's discussing the links of lives of people and how can God be just in the people in the Old Testament and the table of nations and is it Genesis 10:11, somewhere thereabouts, that these people, they lived hundreds and hundreds of years, Methuselah 969 years, but then people today or in his time, they live to 40, 50, 90, 100 years. So does God like or love those people in antiquity much more than now? And obviously he does not think that. So he's trying to defend sort of the justice of God there. And then if you look at Theodore's commentary, broadly speaking, how Theodore presents the material thought by thought, Aḥob is following it. He never quotes exactly. He's typically shortening, summarizing in one manner of fashion, but it's the thought by thought he follows. But then how Theodore concludes, Aḥob completely ignores that and comes to his own conclusion entirely. So it shows how it's like he has the text there and he says, yes, I like these parts, but I'm going to ignore this and do something different. So you can almost, in a sense, kind of reconstruct his thought process, which is somewhat fascinating. For the Genesis text, there it's a similar thing where he's following the points. One difference being is that the different animals that are presented, there's a ram and I'm forgetting the others off the top of my head, I apologize. But in the Septuagint, their order is one way, and then in the Peshitta, it's slightly reordered. And so Theodore faithfully follows the Septuagint, Aḥob faithfully follows the Peshitta, which is not surprising. But other than that, again, they follow similar patterns of thought, but it's not word for word. He never just wholesale takes a chunk of Theodore and claims that as his own. He always takes it, modifies it, puts his own stamp on it, I guess you could say, and then develops it and does something different with it, which is quite common to some degree in the East Syriac exegetical tradition, is that they take an earlier core of material. Beth Qaṭraye has mentioned this, and they developed that in later writers. So I think that was one thing. Please ask your other question again. Do you remember what that was?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this answer. And the second question was about the exegetical methodology. So can you actually, in a way, say that it's non-literal or literal way of interpreting biblical text, or it's just very difficult to say which category it belongs?
Well, Aḥob is very, very much within the East Syriac tradition in that he almost exclusively takes a very literal approach. And in his Genesis 15, 9 through 10 schooling, there is one part, and I read that, where he's making a type of logical connection between the birds flying away and then also the Israelites fleeing or flying out of Egypt. And it's difficult sometimes to get that to show up in English, but in the Syriac, they're almost the same. I don't remember if they're the exact same, but they're very close. And so he's doing word plays. And that type of analogy would, I don't know how well accepted that would have been in this time, or perhaps we just don't really understand what was happening. Typically, it's thought that East Syriac writers abhorred any sort of analogy, that was more Alexandrian in nature. But there is at least one instance of that. But typically, he's very much East Syriac. He's very literal, and he doesn't stray too far from that. Though it wouldn't surprise me if there were other examples of that could be found. But those are anonymous, and I haven't been able to locate them. So
Oh, thank you very much.
well,
Valentina?
Yes, thanks. Thanks a lot, Seth, for this interesting introduction to this author. I have a question. I don't know, maybe a bit off topic, but which came to my mind. Jason Scully, in his book on Isaac mentioned the Physiologus as one of the sources of Isaac, and also of John the Solitary, expressing the transformation like a serpent who leaves his old skin and takes a new body shape. So I wonder if there are other occurrences of the Physiologus, and if by chance these are related to reflection on the inner life, although it's more exegesis.
I'm not sure if I can answer that. You were cutting out a bit, so I could only hear bits and pieces. But one interesting thing I will say about Isaac, somewhat in connection to Aḥob, again, this is very loosely, is that Isaac also uses medical related terminology, as does Aḥob. So again, it goes back to the idea of some kind of school, and it's been mentioned, a school of Beth Qaṭraye. It's perhaps not the best term for it because there's no evidence for that. But was there something in the exegetical theological water, if you will, that they were all drawing from kind of similar sources and using those in very, very different ways? I don't know. But to more specifically to your question, unfortunately I can't answer that anymore. The text was used again, if I heard you correctly. The physiologus was used, and whether or not it speaks more to, say, the interior life in a monastic setting, as far as from Aḥob's point of view, I don't know. There's no evidence that one way or another. He was not really interested in anything monastic as far as what has been preserved. Perhaps the Aḥob that lived a century later might have been more interested in that. If I've completely misunderstood your question, feel free to rephrase it, because you were cutting out a bit there.
Okay, thank you.
Matteo.
Yeah, thank you very much, Seth, for this introduction. It was precious. I maybe didn't understand well, so sorry for the silly question. Have you found other evidences of other Antiochian authors, except Theodore, for example, Diodor or the Christology of Theodorot, or some other Antiochian Greek author translated in Syriac or originally preserved only in Greek? I don't know. And also in the last discussion with Valentina, if I have well understood, so he has no monastic interest as far as we know from his writings. So it is a product of a real exegetical school outside monasteries, do you think, or inside the monasteries, or it is a very complex relationship between the monasteries and schools in this Syrian Orient, you know. But also here, if you have some ideas of, or if I have bad understood. So thank you again.
Sure. As far as other Greek writers, the only other one in his extant works that he uses besides Theodore is Basil of Caesarea, and he relies on his prologue to Psalm 1. But the Greek text of that is well preserved, and I think maybe even has been known longer than the Syriac. I could be wrong about that. But those are, aside from the Physiologus, those are the only Greek writings that he relies on. My editor at Brill was pressing me on that as well and wanting to know if there were other Greek sources, and I said I wish that there were. I would happily develop that, but I can't make stuff out of thin air. That's all that I've been able to find. To answer your other question, what I've referred to as the scholarly milieu of Beth Qaṭraye, whatever that looked like in its originality, I probably had some form of a monastic connection, whether that was taught in an actual monastery, whether it was just taught out of a local home, you know, uncles teaching their nephews or something like that. It's strictly conjecture. Nobody can know what the inner curriculum of that school would have looked like. I would love to know more about it, but there's absolutely no evidence on it. All that's known is that for about a century, from the late 6th to the late 7th century, you have this powerhouse number of people that just show up on the historical scene that are unbelievably educated, and then nothing after that. So clearly something was there. But again, what that was to look like, was it modeled after the school of Nisibis? I mean, chances are that's probably the case based on what Adam Becker has shown in his work on that. That there were a number of, you could call them satellite schools that cropped up around the Mediterranean, the Iranian world, that began to look in many ways like the school of Nisibis on a much smaller scale. So chances are there was something like that, but again, that's strictly conjecture and I can't prove that.
Okay, Marion.
Thank you very much for this interesting lecture. I would like to ask one question, and if I may also give one brief comment. You showed us that Aḥob's interpretations are preserved in the form of scholia, and my question is about the mechanism of transmission. So would it be your impression that Aḥob would have written full commentaries on the biblical books of which his ideas are preserved? And secondly, would you then for example, see somebody like Ishadat having access to the full work and making abbreviations himself. And as to my comment, your case study of Aḥob's use of the physiologus just reminded me that similar ideas about deer hunting snake are also preserved in Greek and Syriac exegetical texts. For example, Gregory of Nyssa also issued that of Murph in his commentary on the Seminole Stones. So that would perhaps be additional evidence that such animal lore would have been quite widespread and well known now. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. To answer the first, initially I was under the impression that he originally produced full commentaries, such as what Ishida is known for producing. And so that was my beginning assumption for many reasons. But as I began to dive into that, and I have a whole section in what is chapter 5 of my forthcoming work on this, all of the evidence, both internal and then the subsequent scribal history, the preservation of these works suggests that they were originally produced as scholia. And what that looked like in the sense of, was it a, something like this, was it a page, and he had marginal notations around for various verses, such as what Jacob of Edessa had, or if it was strictly just scholia, his own thoughts and his study. And he wrote, I was interested in Psalm 5:4, and then he skips down Psalm 29:9, and then Psalm 31, whatever. Who knows? It's very, very difficult to know that because there are no original autographs. But for instance, he never references back and forth. Earlier in my commentary, I stated this. I believe Ishida does things like that. And Aḥob is not the only person in antiquity that would have the following. So with his scholia, one of the most unusual things about it is that it develops in size. And typically, if you have a group of scholia, let's say somebody produced 100 of them in antiquity, scribes will select 90 of them and run with that. And then the next scribes, a couple hundred years after that, they might only take 80 of them. And then little by little over time, they shrink in size. To the present day, we're only left with 14, let's say. And who knows, we would never know how many there were originally. With Aḥob, the material continues to grow. And at first I was a bit nervous. It's like, is this somehow what we might call pseudo Aḥobian material? Is somebody developing this and then putting his name on it because he's well known? But I don't see any evidence for that. It's all very much of the same mind, by the same hand. Sometimes it's a bit reworked, such as what you find in Barbachu's lexicon. He's typically referred to as Hub. Some scribe got lazy and dropped the aleph. And so there it's a little reworked, but it continues to, I wouldn't say grow, but it's that previously unused Aḥob material is used by later traditions. You find that in Barbachu's lexicon, and then you find that in the Denha Gregory commentary in the late 19th century, when they begin to use his exegetical works in the Psalms, which is, again, this is also seen in the Greek world as well, but it's a bit unusual. So as far as his scholia, with the knowledge, as far as I argue for, that they were originally presented as scholia, and I believe that he taught in the school of Seleucia. This was proposed by Roger Cowell, and if that was the case, this functioned in some manner as sort of an early form of the Mizora, where you have several of his scholia that are concerned with words that begin with A or Aleph. So I question, is it possible that he had some sort of alphabetic arrangement to this? Again, it's impossible to know. But if that's the case, that follows an early form of the Mizora, which Jonathan Loopstra has talked about in some of his publications. And there he would have been using that in some form as a classroom manual of instruction in difficult Peshitta words. And he's very consistent about dealing with words that have a different meaning in the Hebrew and a different meaning in the Greek. He often is focused on that intersection, you could say. And so, but the basic transmission of these, to answer your other question, again, that's conjecture. I propose something, again, this can't be proved, is that whether or not he organized his scholia in any kind of recognizable manner, it's impossible to know. It's possible that his students or somebody after him arranged this in some form of alphabetic manner, and that this was transmitted early on in basically a sort of a one-volume compendium. And then especially that could be argued because Ishida has access to such a wide range of these works from multiple different biblical books, that he had access to this. But then I suggest that sometime after the mid-9th century that these were broken into various parts. And then by the time of Abdisho in the 13th or 14th century, he lists that Aḥob produced 2 different volumes of works. So somewhere along the transmission, it was divided into 2, I suggest. And again, this can be proven, but the little bit of evidence that's there, you try to backtrack it, and this seems to be what is the case. Yes.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, Paul, you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Seth, thank you for that. That was really interesting. 2 questions I kind of had for you. So with this kind of trilingual awareness of the different traditions, do you see any evidence that he's even indirectly drawing on someone like Eusebius of Emesa, who kind of in some reconstructions is kind of the root of some of the Antiochian tradition in the 4th century, who, you know, very clearly seems to know, you know, the Hebrew, the Greek, and the Syriac, and also quotes them for his exegesis. And then my second question was just in terms of your dating of Aḥob, is he showing, because I haven't read much of him at all, but does he show any awareness of some of the debates that you have erupting in like the school of Nisibis over, you know, Knoma or things like that, where, you know, you see some people leaning more towards using John Chrysostom or Theodoret versus Theodore, or does he kind of stay away from sort of Christological questions that might show that?
Sure. So I'll answer your second question first. So his Christology, what has been preserved, it doesn't have any of these kind of catchwords that would be, ha, that's East Syriac, ha, that's West Syriac. There's none of that present. It seems very bland. Now, whether that was produced by Aḥob or that was a later scribal rubble, you could say, that's impossible to know. So it's very difficult to know if he originally was engaging with some of these Christological debates that would have been raging in his time, or if he strayed entirely from that. I can't speak to that. I really wish that I could, but that's that is what it is. As far as Eusebius of Emesa, I mean, yeah, I guess indirectly he would be influenced by him because of what Eusebius established for the Antiochian tradition. But he, in what I've read and I've studied, I don't see any direct connection. He's not sitting there with Eusebius's works and being influenced by them in a direct manner. If somebody else could show that, I would happily stand corrected, but I have not seen evidence for that. No.
Okay, anyone else have any other questions? Now is the time to ask pertinent one. Yes, Dan, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm just curious about the reception of Aḥob. You've mentioned the Shodad. Is it this an author that has been used by all exegetical authors after him? Did he get copied a lot? Do we have some 79 manuscript for each of his works and so on? How does that look like? Thank you.
Sure. So he's preserved by 8 different East Syriac writers and manuscript traditions. So you have Nathaniel of Shirzor in the early 7th century. You have Theodore Barconi at the end of the late 8th century. The Den Hager commentary. I mean, the manuscript tradition possibly began in the late 9th century when it was first produced. I'm currently working on figuring out an exact date for that, but they don't start using it until the late 19th century. So in a much later stage of that manuscript tradition. And then you have, see, I mentioned 3 there. So then you have Ishidad, the anonymous commentary, Barbachul, his lexicon, and then Isaac Shabbat in the 15th century. I feel like I'm forgetting somebody, but I'm not sure who I'm missing there. But there are eight different traditions that use them. Oh, the commentary in Genesis to Exodus 9:32 also uses it. So they use varying forms. In my opinion, some of these, if there were more to them, such as the commentary in Genesis Exodus 9:32, if that's the only bit of that commentary that remains. If that were fuller, and say the entire Old Testament or even the Pentateuch, in my opinion, they originally used more of the And that can be known because the anonymous commentary draws on that. And they use various passages from Aḥob, and they state as such according to Aḥob. So yes, they are using it, and the time span of that is 1,300 years. So he had quite the influence, and so yeah.
Thank you. Very nice.
Thank you very much, Seth. Thank you everyone for joining us. And we'll see you next time for our next paper. Have a nice afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Very good seeing everyone.
See you
Have a
soon.
good day. See you soon.